Hello, and welcome to this presentation, which tells the story of three generations of surgeons who led medical services in Kidderminster from 1856 to 1952. My name is Chris Stretton. I am descended from these three men, and reluctantly in 2010 took on the role of one of the family historians when my uncle Anthony died, leaving a large quantity of historical documents. In addition to this, he left a substantial financial legacy, with instructions firstly to install a set of stained glass windows in a church in Kidderminster, celebrating the lives of the three doctors, and secondly, to establish a charitable trust to help support local students who were training in medicine at Cambridge University or St Bartholomew's Hospital in London, both institutions where the doctors trained. As we will learn, the stained glass windows were installed in 2015. 10 years later, the church wished to celebrate the anniversary of their installation and asked me to give a presentation telling the story of the doctors, which I delivered in the church on the 7th of December 2025, and which was attended by nearly 50 people. This talk was recorded on the night and is available to see online, and is reproduced here as a narrated slideshow, retaining all the work that I put into its production and making it available for a much wider audience. I hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoyed researching it and putting it together. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to come and talk to you this evening and give you some background to the three doctors from my family who are celebrated in the three stained glass windows here and funded by my uncle Anthony Stretton's legacy. My bloodline goes back directly to these three men. My father, who was a GP, being the eldest son of the youngest of the three doctors whom we remember tonight. So, I wouldn't be here without these three doctors, who headed up almost 100 years of medical and social services and development in Kidderminster and its surrounding area, and who certainly warrant the dynasty tag. Of the three, Samuel, John Lionel and John Weston Stretton, Lionel was the most significant and the one about whom we know the most, so I will be able to tell you a bit more about him rather than his father and his son. I will start by giving you a general introduction to the dynasty before speaking about the individual doctors themselves. I will finish with information about initiatives still to come to fruition. To start, before I tell you about the three doctors, Samuel, Lionel and John, perhaps I should tell you a bit about myself. If I'd been a medic, then I would have been fifth generation in our family. I wasn't. Instead, I trained as a scientist and went into preventive medicine, working for Welsh Water. Firstly as a support scientist, then an operational manager, and finally designing and implementing a business management system. All of these of which helped to ensure that 3 million people didn't get typhoid every day. Our family is very large. This is a shrunken version. Samuel was one of 10 children and Lionel one of 15. I'm at the bottom with the three doctors highlighted in red. I mentioned at the start how I reluctantly fell into the role of family historian after inheriting Anthony's archive of material. This needed sorting, as it was a random collection of items assembled over the years, including many documents, photos, certificates, relating to many different members of the wider family. Several years on, these are all now stored safely in the Hive in Worcester as part of their historical archive, all of which I digitised beforehand, which took me 2 years. As I was sorting and scanning all the documents, my interest in family history was piqued by one particular document, a newspaper report that I came across in the boxes. This large and significant article was published just a week after Lionel died, on 21st of February 1943 in the Sunday Dispatch, a national newspaper. At Kidderminster Hospital, Lionel, through scientific experiment, had pioneered the use of tincture of iodine for sterilising the skin, and anyone who has benefited from its application, which was of international importance, will empathise with a headline from this article: "The man who made the world say, oh!" More on this later. But what really piqued my interest and rattled my conscience was that this article spoke of Lionel in the same breath as this man, Joseph Lister, of whom I'm sure you will have heard, yet Lionel is largely unknown for his importance and his key place in medical history. Catalysed by this, I felt a strong responsibility to try and remedy this omission, encouraged by the implicit intent of Anthony's will to promote the reputation and story of the three doctors. As we will see during my talk, I and Anthony's executors have found a number of different initiatives allowing us to promote the story. My first opportunity arose through my father, who had died in 1999, but thankfully had retained a carbon copy of the manuscript of Lionel's memoirs, and which was subsequently kept safe by my brother. Entitled 56 Years a Surgeon, Recollections and Reflections, it was written by him, typed up by his secretary, in the early 1940s, but never published. This wasn't for want of trying, however. In the file with the manuscript were a number of rejection letters from various publishers, including this one from Heinemann, who returned it stating, "While it is a very interesting production and has much historical value, it would be more interesting 50 years hence than now." With this manuscript to hand, I was able to start on my quest to promote Lionel's legacy. To cut several stories short, I published a book in 2012, changing the title to something a little less of a mouthful, Memoirs of the Iodine Surgeon. His style of writing needed very little editing by me, although I had to replace Z's with S's. I also added appendices of relevant texts, for example the 1909 British Medical Journal article, where he told the world about the success of tincture of iodine. Heinemann's observation came up a bit short. It took 72 years, not 50, to be interesting enough to come to print. You can buy a copy of the book through this website if you're interested in reading more about Lionel. Memoirs of the Iodine Surgeon was launched at Kidderminster Town Hall on the 9th of October 2012 by Dr. Richard Taylor, himself a medic and ex-MP for the area. Publication of this was a significant result for me and concluded the first of several initiatives that I and the executors of Anthony's estate, Jim Quinn and Eunice Roberts, have driven to promote the three doctors' stories. Also launched at that event was Dr. Stretton, I Presume, a book commissioned by the executors of Anthony's estate. Researched and written by Kidderminster's local historian, Nigel Gilbert, this tells the story of all three doctors and provided the basis to inform the first of Anthony's bequests, the design and installation of a set of stained glass windows in our church to celebrate the three doctors' lives. This book is a second initiative in promotion of the doctor's story and can be bought from this website. Alongside publishing Lionel's book, I produced a website telling his story and making much of the family's archive material, which I'd earlier digitized, accessible to the wider world. And this was the third initiative to promote the family story. As we learned earlier, Anthony, middle son of the third Doctor, left his money to fund the stained glass windows and establish a charitable trust. Through the hard work of Anthony's executors, Jim and Eunice, the John Weston Stretton of Kidderminster charity was established in 2013, providing bursaries for local students wishing to study medicine at Cambridge and or St Bartholomew's Hospital in London. This was our fourth initiative to remember the family. The charity has recently extended the range of qualifying institutions to include the new Three Counties Medical School at the University of Worcester. To date, we've supported over 90 students. With the book, Dr. Stretton, I Presume, complete, we were now able to move forward on the church window project. Of the various churches in Kidderminster, St John the Baptist chose to accept our offer of the windows, having an ideal location for 3 separate windows. This takes us to 2015, when Anthony's executors ran a competition to choose a company to design and install the windows. Michael Stokes Design won and were commissioned to proceed with the project. The windows were purpose-made for the triptych celebration of the three doctors, and their position could not have been better overlooking the new hospital. This was our 5th initiative in promoting the Doctor's story. The windows were installed in the second half of 2015 and, facing south, look lovely as the sun streams through them on a sunny day, illuminating the congregation and changing colour as the sun moves around. Here you can see the 3 windows, Samuel representing faith, Lionel representing charity, and John representing hope. Following their installation, the windows were blessed by the Right Reverend John Inge, Bishop of Worcester, in a service on the 6th of December 2015, almost exactly 10 years ago to the day of this celebration. This is the booklet we produced for the event. It has 36 pages, interpreting the designs and telling much of the background to the windows and the family's story. It is available on this website as a downloadable PDF. My next and our 6th opportunity to promote the family story came in the form of an exhibition at the Museum of Carpet in Kidderminster, funded by our charity. Material from both the recently published books and my archive of family historical material provided the basis for this exhibition, entitled A Century of Surgeons, that was hosted by the museum in the first half of 2015 and designed by Sue Hetherington of Siona Designs. If you missed this exhibition and are interested, all is not lost. You can still see it and experience it as a virtual tour on the John Lionel Stretton website. Now, with that background behind us, let's move on to the main part of the talk and allow me to tell you a bit about the doctors themselves, starting with some evidence of their work in Kidderminster, which I've unearthed during my research into their story. Whilst working with Adrian Gregson, archivist for Worcestershire County Council, to secure our material at the Hive, we came across a wealth of old material, thankfully saved from the hospital when it closed. This included the Infirmary Daybook, covering the period from 1872 to 1902. This runs to over 100 pages and has many handwritten entries by both Samuel and Lionel, and includes numerous fascinating entries, of which here are 4 of the more amusing examples. On the 24th of September 1875, Samuel is sufficiently aggrieved to record, "The bread shown to me today is not fit for the patient's use." Then, on the 23rd of May 1888, we learn that an inpatient, name of Henry Stafford, having misconducted himself and disobeyed the orders of a nurse, has this day been discharged for the same. Ah, the good old days. I can just see the Shuttle's headlines if that happened today. And on the 12th of October 1890, Lionel records, "I find that it is the custom to keep the post-mortem instruments in the operating room, which is most improper. Provision for keeping them in the mortuary ought to be made immediately." The flourishes of his signature, which you see here, suggest that he was not amused. And the last of these fascinating examples, on the 9th of May 1896, Lionel is still clearly not amused, writing, "A doubtful object of charity. Mary May, daughter of the landlord of the Mitre Oak Inn, attends as an outpatient with a note from Mr. Harvey." The response in red reads, "Too poor to be able to pay." The infirmary provided charitable services for the poor, but it was necessary to be sponsored through the note system. In an initiative to promote development of medical skills in the locality, in 1893, Samuel and Lionel established the Kidderminster Medical Society, which is still in existence today and is thought to be the longest established such body in existence. In his book, written in the early 1940s, Lionel records, "In 1893, the Kidderminster Medical Society was formed, with my father as its first president and myself as its first secretary. The society still continues its work and has done an enormous amount of good. It has fostered friendly relations between its members, and by its scientific meetings, held 3 or 4 times a year, it tends to improve the character of the work of the profession in the district. At these meetings, papers on medical or surgical subjects are read, cases are described and specimens shown. Several of Lionel's papers presented at these meetings form the basis for sections of his book, covering matters such as mistakes of the profession, alarming experiences, legal experiences, fashions, medical and other. Lionel had an opinion on everything, and you'll find out some entertaining stories in his book. You might be used to getting all your information electronically these days, but it isn't so long ago that we relied on paper and pen. This was certainly the case back in those days. The original Kidderminster Medical Society Minute Book, from its inception, still exists and is displayed in the Education Centre in the hospital over the road from the church. This document also includes the Code of Medical Etiquette, including the requirement that no member should lower the dignity of the profession by deriving pecuniary benefit from the sale of any secret remedy. Now let me tell you about the individual doctors. Whereas it's no surprise that I didn't know either Samuel or Lionel personally, despite them both celebrating their golden wedding anniversaries and living to ripe old ages, Samuel was 87 and Lionel 83, it is a particular regret that, although I have happy childhood memories of his home, Lee Grange at the top of Bewdley Hill, and staying there with my grandmother, I have no significant memories of my grandfather John, who died in 1952, aged only 64, when I was just 2. In working with the historical material, however, especially having scanned hundreds of photos and personal documents, I feel I know them really well and love to be able to go back in time and meet them all. So I think I've got qualifications to tell you a bit about them all, and will now give you a flavour of their lives, characters and achievements. Starting with my great-great-grandfather Samuel. We don't know much about his early days, other than he was born in Leicester in 1832 to parents William Weston and Jane. In his memoirs, Lionel recalls his grandfather, Samuel's father, with these words: I have never heard of his doing any work, but he was a justice of the peace, and he used to go down to the town every morning and often sat on the bench. He impressed upon me the importance of the homely virtues of neatness, punctuality, and the regular payment of accounts. Must be where I get it from. He also liked to drink of port, believing that once opened a bottle should be consumed the same day. Samuel clearly had some artistic skills, however. These drawings are a small selection from his student's sketchbook. Samuel qualified at Bart's Hospital in 1853, following which his first job was a surgeon in the Crimea, working at the Renkioi Hospital until 1856. Rumoured history within the family records that, whilst at Bart's, Samuel worked with Isambard Kingdom Brunel on the design of the prefabricated field hospitals that he was developing for use in the Crimea. In February 1855, Brunel was invited by the War Office to design these units, which proved to be very successful. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to prove this yet, but the dates fit. Whilst in the Crimea, Samuel was recorded as having emulated Lord Byron by swimming the Hellespont and back in his spare time. This is recorded in the reference to the event in the book Memories of 80 Years, published in 1910 by John Beddoe. Herein it states, about that time too, I suppose it was, that 2 of our comrades performed the Leander Byron feat of swimming the Hellespont from Abydos to Sestos and back. They were Barda, an athletic Swabian from the Black Forest, and Stretton, still living in Droitwich, a well-made but delicate-looking blonde, who once went on leave for a week to Assos, sleeping of course in native houses, and returned with 300 flea bites on one of his hands. Returning home from the Crimea in 1856, Samuel bought number 27 Church Street, with its associated medical practice in Kidderminster, from a Dr. Thomas Thursfield. Married a year later to Kate Birch, the daughter of a Leicester surgeon, himself one of 10 children, he then proceeded to have 15 of his own, 3 of whom didn't survive early childhood and only 2 of whom were girls, Gertrude and Katie. Clearly this huge family proved too much for Samuel on top of his medical workload. To reduce this, he gave 5 of his boys £100 each and told them to go and make a new life in New Zealand. At least one was only 16 when he went. A report from the Kidderminster Shuttle in 1892 recorded that Francis and Philip were heading off to New Zealand to join their 3 brothers who were already there. It also notes that the eldest had been there for 5 or 6 years and was in possession of some 2,000 acres of land. Another had a store and was a postmaster. Harry, who had left Kidderminster in 1883, worked on a farm and is almost certainly the one on the right of this picture, as he records an accident with an axe in an article in the Shuttle written in 1889. Not only did Samuel have his private practice, but in 1857 he was appointed honorary surgeon at the infirmary. Providing medical services to the workhouse also, he was most concerned with the poor living conditions suffered by many people and the unsatisfactory sewage and drinking water services in the town. Conflict with local politicians and industrialists was inevitable, something Lionel would also experience for much of his career. Improvements to the infirmary were also required, and Samuel played a huge part in fundraising and building of the new Mill Street Infirmary that opened in 1871. You can still see this magnificent building, which has now been converted into apartments. Samuel made a good living from his private practice and, with a salaried role as medical officer at the workhouse, was thus able to give his services free of charge at the infirmary. I can find no records as to the commissioning of this, but maybe it was in recognition for his role in completing the work on the hospital that a bust was commissioned, dated 1873, by George Papworth. You can see this in the Education Centre, which is in the hospital over the road. As we will learn, all 3 doctors had an innovative, creative side, no doubt stimulated by problems that they encountered during their work and which they sought to solve. This started with Samuel inventing and patenting the Stretton Noiseless Funeral Beer. An advertisement for the beer records, "After very extensive use during the last 25 years, this beer has received general recommendation. It is noiseless and easily propelled by hand, and, where graves interfere with its wheel progress, it can be readily carried with its burden. It has been used on many important occasions and is equal to the conduct of any class of funeral. When once the coffin is placed upon the bier, it needs no further handling, and it can be lowered through the bier, if desired, as it stands over the grave. Price from £17 10s. I was never quite sure about this, a surgeon promoting a tool for the dead, wondering if there might be a conflict of interest somewhere here." Kidderminster's funeral directors, Edwin Harris, still has one of these, which was refurbished and used by my uncle Anthony at his funeral in Rock Church in 2010. In the Crimea, Samuel was undoubtedly influenced by Florence Nightingale and her pioneering approach to nursing. He was instrumental in developing nurse training courses at the infirmary in Kidderminster to be carried on by Lionel, who saw first-class training school for nurses status being awarded in 1922. Samuel and Kate celebrated their golden wedding at a large party in the town hall on the 30th of April 1907, for which this is an original invitation card. This original photo was taken at this golden wedding celebration. We will see this again later in another context. Kate was to die in 1912 and Samuel in 1920. They are buried together in Trimpley churchyard, apparently choosing their last resting place for no other reason than that they liked the view from the site. This picture records the time when 5 descendants visited the grave in 2018 following our work to refurbish it. Now, moving on to John Lionel, always known as Lionel. As we have seen earlier, Lionel recorded anecdotes and aspects from his life in his book, so we know a lot more about him. Born in 1860, he records an early interest in matters medical, accompanying his father on house and hospital visits before he was 10 years old. He performed his first operation when he was just 11. His book records that a wheelwright carried on his trade near our house, and my brothers and I were constantly in his yard. I fear we must often have delayed and annoyed him, but he was very good-natured and never complained to our father about us. One day he said to me, "Well, young Sawbones, do you think you could pull out a tooth for me?" Even then I was cautious enough to ask him to open his mouth so that I could examine the tooth. It was a right upper molar just beginning to loosen. I agreed to undertake the operation. I rushed home and secured an old pair of forceps that my father had relegated to the tool basket, and, armed with these, I returned. The old man sat on a log in his yard, and I extracted the tooth. I rather fancy I failed to obtain any fee, but that did not interest me in those days. When my father found out about this, he related the story to many of his friends, with the result that I had several extractions to perform, for which I received gratuities. My most important patient was my father himself. He afterwards explained that he allowed me to operate because he knew I should stop if he ordered me to do so. Should I? I remember he groaned, but I pulled out the tooth. Lionel was clearly very practical, but not a particularly good student. Recalling? I went to a boarding school when I was 9 years old, but I was never well there and had to spend most of my time in the sick room. Consequently, I was brought home to attend the King Charles I School, Kidderminster, usually called the grammar school. I was then 10 years old. I had a distaste for lessons and had always evaded them by every means I could think of, so I naturally found myself much behind my fellow pupils of the same age. I never did any work that I could avoid at school. I spent all my available time in the playground and had sufficient brains to be able to hold my own in school while learning my lessons on the way home, so I managed to escape punishment. Classics I abhorred, mathematics I revelled in. I always felt a grievance against the headmaster. I protested to him against being asked to commit poetry to memory. I did not care whether the way was long and the wind was cold. It mattered nothing to me. I told the headmaster that I was quite willing to do double the amount of mathematics, natural philosophy, or anything of that kind, but I did not want to waste my time in learning poetry. He would not listen. I maintain that one of the great faults of education is this kind of cast-iron system, with its rules applied to all alike. For a master to refuse to listen to a boy who has sufficient intelligence and initiative to make such a reasonable request seems to me inexcusable. You may not be surprised to learn that his results were not promising, but his father clearly wanted him to pursue a medical career, so, again from his book, I left school in 1876, not having passed any qualifying examination. I was then sent to a coach in Birmingham to be prepared for the preliminary examination of the Royal College of Surgeons, an examination which has since been given up. My coach was a classical scholar, a member of the medical profession, and a kind of recluse. He prided himself on the fact that no woman had been into his study for 15 years. I went there every day by train and used to take books with me, which I studied on the journey there and back. I had only a short time for preparation, but I passed the examination in March 1877. In April 1877, I was apprenticed to my father, and this was the beginning of my professional training. Lionel put huge importance on the apprenticeship process, of the opinion that it was the best start for a trainee doctor. In 1878, His father took him up to Barts to continue his professional training. Looking forward to participating in sports for some relaxation, he soon realised that he had a lot of work to do and that sports would be a distraction. So he sent all his kit back home and knuckled down to qualifying. In 1880, he took his Royal College of Surgeons exam, but failed, having misread a question and given a very good answer, but the wrong one. To add to his misfortune at this time, Lionel then contracted diphtheria and scarlet fever simultaneously. He was in a coma for 5 days. The event is recalled in Samuel's letter, printed in the British Medical Journal in July 1881. Sir, 2 months ago I was summoned to town to find a medical student, my son, in great danger with diphtheric throat, and feeling that his life could only be saved by immediate removal from his lodgings to hospital care, I cast about for a proper conveyance. Various messengers were sent to different owners of the same. At last one was found willing to undertake the removal, a distance under a mile. He would not show his vehicle or promise it before a deposit of 10 shillings, about £50 today, was made. On its arrival I was in dismay, the landlady and the whole square deeply shocked at the sight of the conveyance. I can only describe it as a cross between a hearse and a dirty linen cart, painted black and with funereal glass side. A black horse with dismal harness and a driver of the most woeful aspect, also in deep black. It was surely enough to put the finish to any sensitive patient, dangerously ill as my son then was. Surely in these days the metropolis will not long delay this much-needed proper ambulance provision. I am faithfully yours, Samuel Stretton. Despite losing 4 months whilst recovering, Lionel passed his Royal College of Surgeons exams in October 1881 and was appointed junior anaesthetist at Barts. The following summer he was promoted to house surgeon and resident midwifery assistant. His future in London looked well assured. Then, in October 1882, he received a telegram telling him that Samuel was seriously ill. If he didn't return to Kidderminster to help his father, it was likely that he would die. Clearly, he had no choice. Resigning his Barts positions and returning to Kidderminster, Lionel moved into number 27 Church Street, which was to be both his family home and private practice for 56 years. As we saw earlier, Samuel had bought the property and the private practice from one Thomas Thursfield when he returned from the Crimea in 1856. By strange coincidence, many years later, it reverted to the Thursfield family, now in the business of soliciting, or should that be law. It has since been sold and converted into flats. I found a few old photos of number 27 in the archive boxes that I inherited. This one is of the surgery operating theatre in number 27. And this is of the dining room with 2 portraits, one of Samuel and one of Lionel. Sadly, these have been lost, unless you know otherwise. If you do, please let me know. In 1884, Lionel married Lucy Emma Horton, and they had just 3 children, Rosa, Samuel and John. Clearly learning from the 2 generations before them, they practiced a new level of family planning. I was grateful for this formal family photo taken in the rear of number 27 Church Street, which I obtained from the contents of one of the archive boxes that I'd inherited. You might recognise it as being the front cover of the memoirs book. Lionel and Lucy's eldest, Rosa, trained in London as a dispenser and worked for her father for a while. This picture is of her at work in number 27. There is little doubt that she would have loved to follow her father in his profession, but times were different then. And this is her certificate, confirming her qualification as an Assistant of the Society of Apothecaries, London, confirming her ability in the compounding and dispensing of medicines. Samuel, the middle child, proved to be the black sheep of the family. Before the war, as a manager in a carpet factory, he struck up a non-marital relationship with a loom worker by the name of Nellie Powell, and they had an illegitimate son. Lionel, the archetypal Victorian, was clearly not amused, and she was sent off to the USA. But she did come home to give the birth. That's a whole other story, which I won't be covering here, but may be told elsewhere in future. Returning from the First World War, Samuel Jr. suffered what we now call PTSD, and in 1920 married Lionel's matron, Anne McFarlane, probably by Lionel's arrangement. Young John fulfilled Lionel's hopes of following in the family tradition, and we will learn more about him and his medical career in due course. In his book, Lionel tells of numerous anecdotes and opines on many of life's issues. I don't have time to cover many of these, other than to select a few headings where he tells of accidents with cars and horses, dealing with a drunken patient armed with a revolver whom the local policeman wouldn't approach, visiting Robert Koch, one of the founders of modern microbiology in Germany, and getting left behind on the trackside after he attended passengers injured in the derailing of his train, sacking house surgeons for inappropriate behaviour with nurses, and sacking nurses due to drunkenness and drug taking, dodgy horse dealings, being persuaded by his brother Edward Albert, who had a garage business in Cheltenham, to buy the first car in the town, but having to have 3 cars in his garage, so his chauffeur Harry Teal could try to make sure that at least one would be working at any time, going back to horses when this didn't work out, riding a penny farthing through town in a frock coat and top hat, recreated in 2015 as part of the Century of Surgeons exhibition, pictured here, descending 150 feet into the town's water well by rope to check its structure, walking through the town's sewers to check structure. These last 2 were performed whilst he was an elected councillor, keen to improve conditions for the less well-off in the town. I'll have to leave you to read all about these in his book, but can't leave this section without recalling that in 1904 he almost died again when he contracted anthrax from one of his patients, who no doubt had caught it from the fleeces used in the carpet manufacturing process. He was unconscious again for 5 days, but back at work within 6 weeks. As a surgeon, Lionel was responsible for much of the administrative management of the hospital and records that he carried out over 40,000 operations. But, following in his father's creative footsteps, Lionel found time to invent several things, including aseptic hospital furniture, the basic design of which is still to be seen today. A portable operating table, no doubt developed to facilitate his private practice work, which took him around the locality. We know of one occasion where he visited a patient on the Clee Hill and had to operate on the kitchen table. And not forgetting an improved adjustable commode. He also designed and published a series of ambulance lectures in 1889. But undoubtedly his greatest and internationally important claim to fame was the one I touched upon earlier, his pioneering work on the introduction to the medical profession across the world of tincture of iodine for sterilizing the skin. Prior to this, preparation for surgery involved shaving and scrubbing several times with carbolic acid. This was time-consuming, not very good for the skin, and not very effective at controlling infection. Many deaths occurred due to infections rather than a problem for which the surgery had been carried out. Lionel's discovery revolutionized this process, being highly effective and, of course, having the added advantage of being able to see where the application had been made. Following a series of scientific experiments whilst operating on patients in Kidderminster Infirmary, Lionel presented his findings in a paper published in the British Medical Journal in 1909. He might well have made patients say, "Ooh!" but his discovery revolutionized surgery and has undoubtedly been responsible for saving untold numbers of lives around the world since then. You might not even be here had he not introduced the world to the benefits of this disinfectant. I mentioned Lionel's administrative responsibilities earlier and can't move on without mention of his key role in fundraising and building of the children's extension to Mill Street Infirmary. Getting money for building and running the hospital was a constant battle, and Lionel didn't have the NHS's administrators to do this for him then. Whilst I was researching the family story, I came across this film in the Media Archive for Central England, which records the Duke of York opening the extension. Look out for Lionel with his characteristic moustache. This is just a part of the video. The complete version is available on the website. Lionel kept working almost to the end, interviewed by the Shuttle in January 1942, only a year before he died at the age of 82. The Shuttle also records that there were proposals for Lionel to be knighted, but this came to naught. Maybe he had annoyed people in higher places throughout his career. Now, let's move on to John. John was born in 1888. Like his grandfather, we do not have a lot of information about his early days. Having first gone to Malvern College, John received his medical training at Caius College, Cambridge, where he was a keen sportsman, before going on to Barts to qualify as MRCS and LRCP in 1913. After a short stint as a house surgeon at Barts, the war broke out and John volunteered for the Royal Army Medical Corps and served throughout the war as a captain. In 1919 he returned to Kidderminster, where he practised from his home at Westwood, number 50, Bewdley Road, until in 1921 he was appointed as surgeon in the infirmary and at Dudley Guest Hospital, where he was always affectionately referred to as Mr. John. In 1923, John married Mary Smellie and they had 3 boys, my father being the eldest and the one to carry on the medical traditions as a GP after a stint in the RAF during the Second World War. I was ever grateful that the surnames were not reversed. John was a keen photographer and thus usually behind the lens, but I found one family picture of them all, and John clearly had a sense of humour, as demonstrated by this turn of his cine camera. Here, the family is enjoying the Lido in about 1936. John carried on the family's innovative bent, pioneering radium treatment locally in 1929, inventing catgut tube forceps in 1934, and developing a new system for treating inguinal and femoral hernias using a silk net reinforcing mesh in 1942. His wife, Mary, my grandmother, knitted, or should that be knotted, these at home. Thankfully, his paper records that the nets were sterilised by boiling for 20 minutes immediately prior to use. This forms the basis for hernia treatments to this day. In his spare time, John put in a lot of energy to the Scouts, being District Commissioner for 10 years up until his death. Summer scouting camps involved borrowing a flatbed lorry from a local carpet factory loading up the tents and equipment with the boys sitting on top and driving to camp. Health and safety hadn't been invented then, obviously. John's death was dramatic. Having just addressed a group of nurses on stage at a prize-giving event at the hospital, he sat back into his chair where he collapsed and died of a massive heart attack on the stage. He was only 64, and this brought to an end almost 100 years of his family's leadership of local medical services. Thus ended the dynasty. But this is not quite the end of my story. Having published Lionel's memoirs, I spoke to my friend Aileen Rees, who owns the TV production company Telescope based in Swansea. I wondered if she might be interested to produce a documentary on his life and achievements. She thought we could do better, and in 2016, Aileen and I were able to engage the services of Rob Gittins, a screenwriter and novelist whose CV includes EastEnders, Casualty, The Bill, Emmerdale, and many other programmes with which you will be familiar. The charity funded Rob to develop an outline script for a 6-part TV series. This resulted in production of the so-called Series Bible in 2018, which outlined the story and provided us with something to pitch to potential broadcasters. The plan is for a significant series of programmes, each telling the story of the 3 doctors in the period 1910 to 1920. Development of this has been a long burn and has stalled recently thanks to the overwhelming woke agendas of how life has changed in the period since the story was first written. Unfortunately, none of the companies that we approached were prepared to commission the series, although, without exception, they all rated the story highly. All was not lost, however. In order to try and trigger the interest in the TV series, earlier this year we commissioned publication of an historical novel based on Rob Gittins' storylines. Adrian Hobart has written this story based on the first 2 episodes of the TV script. The book will be launched at the newly refurbished Kidderminster Town Hall in the Easter holidays next year, 2026. Look out for it in the shops immediately after then. Publication will achieve our 7th initiative to get our story out there. Remember the picture of the golden wedding celebrations I showed you earlier? This is the point at which the novel starts, and it's a great read, which should give both Kidderminster and the doctors a great profile. Hopefully this will lead to the TV series and more. I will then be able to feel I've achieved my objective of getting the doctors' stories told. Our 8th initiative is to install a blue plaque on number 27 Church Street. Joseph Lister has one, so too should Lionel. I had hoped that the new owners of 27 would be prepared to meet the small cost of this, but they weren't. Thankfully, the charity has agreed to fund this, installation of which is being managed by the Kidderminster Civic Society. The words agreed are: John Lionel Stretton, 1860 to 1943, pioneer of the medical use of tincture of iodine, lived and worked here from 1882 to 1938. The 9th initiative is another one to have a long burn. Prior to COVID's interruption to life, I learned that the Museum of Military Medicine was planning to move its location and build new in Cardiff. I was in discussion with the museum's director, Jason Semmons, who was keen to include details of Lionel in the new design. Unfortunately, the new build will not go ahead, but they are redeveloping a new facility at Whittington Barracks, home of the Defence Medical Services, in due course. I remain in touch with Jason to ensure that Lionel's story is featured here. Now I get into double figures, our 10th initiative. My wife and I stumbled across this museum when we visited Chester recently. It tells the history of medicine, disease and bodily matters. Included is a timeline of developments and achievements in medicine. Joseph Lister is there, of course, but no Lionel Stretton. I brought their attention to this serious omission, for which they were very grateful. They are currently in the process of promoting Lionel's story through their website and blogs. It may be a while until they can add a physical reference in the actual museum due to space and design limitations. At least they now know. Finally, my list continues. The old Operating Theatre Museum in London clearly needs my attention, but I haven't got there yet. And there are other relevant museums whom I have to contact. Thackeray Museum of Medicine, Leeds, Hunterian Museum, London, Royal College of Physicians Museum, London. I'm still searching for others. And that's it. I hope you enjoyed learning about my family history as much as I did in researching it and putting this together. If you would like to learn more about their stories and access much old material that I have archived, please check out the John Lionel Stretton website, where you can also download the 36-page booklet in the Church Windows section. You can order the books from the website if you would like a deeper dive into the stories that I have outlined herein. Thanks for watching.